For 3 years, she made herself a ghost in his own home. She ignored him so completely that he became a stranger in his own bed. But then, he started coming home at 3:00 a.m. every single night, and suddenly, the silence she had carefully built began to scream. The clock on the microwave in the gourmet kitchen glowed a cold, neon 3:02 a.m. Outside, the city was a blur of hazy lights and sleeping skyscrapers, but inside the penthouse, the air was thick enough to choke on. Tracy Jacobs-Kwon didn't look like a woman who was losing her mind. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, draped in a rose-pink silk robe that cost more than most people's cars. She held a glass of vintage wine in one hand, her arms folded tightly across her chest. Her long, jet-black hair was perfectly straight, her sharp cheekbones highlighted by the dim glow of the city. On the surface, she was the picture of mafia royalty, composed, elegant, and regal. But if you looked closer, you'd see her knuckles were white. She had been standing in that exact spot since midnight, her eyes fixed on the front door. Welcome. Before we continue, please hit that like button, subscribe and comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. Now, let's dive in. Then the sound of the electronic lock chimed. The heavy mahogany door creaked open, and Tae-Il stepped inside. The man who controlled the city's underworld didn't look like a king tonight. He looked exhausted. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the dark ink of the tattoos on his chest. He was carrying his expensive dress shoes in one hand, walking in his socks as if he was trying to sneak past a shadow. When his eyes met Tracy's, he didn't apologize. He didn't offer an excuse. He simply froze, a flicker of guilt crossing his sharp features before he masked it with that familiar, hardened indifference. The fact that Tracy was awake, and the fact that Tae-Il was trying to be quiet, told the whole story. It was a marriage where pride had become a weapon. She had ignored him for years to protect her heart, and now he was returning the favor by disappearing into the night. But to understand how the Ice Queen of Atlanta and the most feared man in the Korean syndicate ended up like two ghosts in a $20 million tomb, we have to go back. Back to when Tracy was just Tracy, a woman with a regal jawline and a heart she hadn't yet learned to hide. Back to the night he first looked at her, not as a target, but as his entire world. The transition from the vibrant Tracy he had married to the woman standing by the window didn't happen in a single night of fire and shouting. It was a slow, glacial shift, the kind that happens when you stop watering a garden because you're too afraid of the thorns. For 3 years, the penthouse on the 64th floor had stopped being a home and became a gallery of beautiful, frozen things. To the outside world, Tracy Jacobs-Kwon was the envy of every woman in Atlanta. She had the black card accounts, the custom-fitted wardrobe, and a husband whose name could open any door or close any mouth in the city. But inside those walls, she had become the architect of her own isolation. The silent years began shortly after the honeymoon phase evaporated into the harsh reality of Tae-Il's world. In the beginning, Tracy would wait up. She would leave the porch light on and keep a plate warm, her heart jumping at every sound of a car in the driveway. But Tae-Il, burdened by the weight of a syndicate that demanded his soul, would return late, smelling of smoke and secrets he refused to share. He thought he was protecting her by keeping her in the dark, never realizing that to a woman like Tracy, darkness feels exactly like abandonment. The first time she ignored him was a Tuesday. He had come home at 2:00 a.m., exhausted, reaching out to brush his hand against her shoulder as she lay in bed. She didn't move. She didn't breathe harder. She simply stayed perfectly still, pretending to be a statue. She decided then that if she couldn't have his truth, he wouldn't have her warmth. Slowly, the rejection became her throne. She stopped asking where he was. She stopped leaving the light on. She began to occupy the penthouse like a queen in a besieged castle, moving through the marble hallways with a grace that was as sharp as a razor. She would sit at the long, mahogany dining table, her posture perfect, eating her meals in a silence so profound it made Tae-Il feel like a trespasser. When he spoke, She would offer one-word answers, her almond-shaped eyes looking through him rather than at him. She watched him try at first. He would bring home jewelry that stayed in their velvet boxes, or offer awkward, strained compliments that she would meet with a cold, polite thank you before turning back to her book. She was teaching him what it felt like to be invisible, not realizing that she was disappearing right along with him. The penthouse, with its 360-degree views of the skyline, had become a gilded cage where the only rule was that no one was allowed to be vulnerable. Tae-Il eventually stopped trying. He accepted the role of the intruder, retreating into his office or staying out later just to avoid the suffocating weight of her indifference. They became masters of the near miss, crossing paths in the kitchen without making eye contact, sharing a bed like two tectonic plates waiting for the inevitable earthquake. Tracy thought her pride was her shield, a way to show him she didn't need a man who was only half present. She didn't realize that by reigning over a kingdom of silence, she was starving the only thing that had ever made her feel alive. The first crack in the ice didn't come from a shout but from a scent. It happened on a Thursday, the kind of humid Atlanta night where the air feels like a damp blanket, and the silence in the penthouse felt particularly heavy. Tracy had been lying in bed, staring at the shadows of the ceiling fan as they rotated in a hypnotic, rhythmic circle. She had mastered the art of faking sleep, but tonight her heart was packing. When the heavy mahogany door finally clicked open at 3:12 a.m., she felt her entire body go rigid. Tae-Il moved through the darkened suite like a ghost, his footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rugs. Usually, he would head straight for the shower, the sound of running water serving as the only lullaby in their fractured home. But tonight, he paused. He stood at the edge of the bed for a fraction of a second too long, and as he leaned over to set his watch on the nightstand, a breeze from the open balcony window carried it to her. It wasn't the metallic tang of gunpowder or the expensive, woody cologne he had worn since their wedding. It was jasmine, a soft, floral, and undeniably feminine fragrance that clung to the fibers of his white dress shirt like a confession. The scent hit Tracy like a physical blow to the chest. For years, she had convinced herself that she didn't care where he went or who he saw, so long as the checks cleared and the silence remained unbroken. She had built her throne on the idea that she was untouchable, but in that single moment, the Ice Queen felt the first terrifying heat of a fire she thought she had extinguished. Jealousy, sharp and jagged, sliced through her carefully constructed indifference. She stayed perfectly still, her eyes squeezed shut, but her mind was racing through 1,000 scenarios. She pictured him in a dim lounge, a woman's hand resting on the sleeve of his jacket, the same jacket he now tossed carelessly over a chair. She imagined the soft laughter she used to provide, now being offered by someone else who didn't look at him with a gaze made of stone. Tae-Il sighed, a sound of bone-deep weariness, and retreated into the bathroom. As soon as the door clicked shut, Tracy sat up in the dark. Her breath was shallow, her palms damp against the silk sheets. She looked at his discarded jacket, the dark leather gleaming under the moonlight. The pride that had been her shield for 3 years was suddenly a cage. She wanted to scream, to demand a name, to tear the scent of jasmine out of the air. But as she heard the shower start, she realized something even more frightening than the possibility of another woman. She realized that by ignoring him for so long, she had left the door wide open for someone else to walk in. The dormant love she had tried to starve wasn't dead. It was just hungry, and for the first time in 3 years, Tracy Jacobs-Kwon wasn't just cold. She was terrified of losing a man she had spent 1,000 days pretending she didn't want. The jealousy didn't stay a silent flame. It became a restless, driving hunger that stripped away Tracy's poise. By the following afternoon, the penthouse felt less like a throne room and more like a cage of her own making. Every time she caught a stray scent of floral air freshener or even the natural aroma of the lilies on the dining table, her stomach twisted into a knot of cold suspicion. She found herself doing something she hadn't done in 3 years. She began to look for him. Not for the man, but for the evidence of his betrayal. The search was methodical and quiet, fueled by a frantic energy she masked with a calm face. She waited until the sun began to dip behind the Atlanta skyline, casting long, bruised shadows across the marble floors. Tae-Il was out, presumably at the office, though that word now felt like a bitter lie in her mouth. She moved into his private study, a room she usually avoided to maintain the illusion that she didn't care about his secrets. It was a masculine space, filled with the scent of old paper, expensive leather, and the lingering trace of the man who had become a ghost in her life. She went through the drawers of his heavy oak desk with trembling fingers, heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She told herself she was looking for a name, a photograph, a lingering strand of hair that didn't belong to her. Instead, tucked inside a leather-bound ledger he used for personal accounts, she found a small, unassuming slip of thermal paper. It was a receipt, dated 3 weeks ago, for a security deposit and the first month's rent on a luxury apartment in Buckhead, a part of the city far removed from their usual haunts and the syndicate's main territories. The numbers on the paper were staggering, even by their standards. It wasn't just a rental, it was a sanctuary. Tracy felt the air leave her lungs as she stared at the address. To her, this wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the final, undeniable proof of a life lived without her. She didn't see a safe house or a strategic asset. In her mind, she saw a bedroom filled with the scent of jasmine. She saw Tae-Il, the man she had spent years pretending not to need, laughing with someone else in a kitchen that didn't feel like a tomb. The pride that had sustained her for so long finally began to crumble, replaced by a raw, jagged desperation. She clutched the receipt so hard the edges crinkled, her deep brown skin pale at the knuckles. She realized then that the silent war had a winner, and it wasn't her. While she had been busy reigning over their cold penthouse, he had been building a new world somewhere else. As the clock chimed, signaling the approach of another long, lonely evening, Tracy didn't return to her window. She folded the receipt, tucked it into the pocket of her silk robe, and felt a new, dangerous resolve take hold. She wasn't going to wait for 3:00 a.m. anymore. She was going to find out exactly who was waiting for him at that address. The receipt in her pocket felt like a brand, a scorching piece of evidence that demanded she stop being a spectator in her own life. When Tae-Il left the penthouse the following evening, he didn't realize that the Ice Queen had finally stepped off her throne. Tracy didn't take the armored SUV or the driver the syndicate provided. Instead, she slipped into a nondescript sedan she kept for errands, her heart a frantic drumbeat against her ribs. She followed him at a distance, her eyes locked on the taillights of his black sedan as he wound through the rain-slicked streets of Atlanta, moving away from the glitz of Buckhead and into the industrial skeletal remains of the city's edge. The rain began as a soft mist and quickly turned into a steady, rhythmic downpour that blurred the neon signs of late-night diners. Tae-Il didn't stop at the luxury apartment address on the receipt. Instead, he pulled into a narrow, debris-strewn alleyway behind a row of abandoned warehouses. Tracy killed her headlights and rolled to a stop half a block away, her breath fogging the windshield. She watched through the veil of rain as Tae-Il stepped out of his car, his expensive wool coat dark with moisture. He didn't look like a man arriving for a tryst. He looked like a man walking toward a gallows. From the shadows of a recessed doorway, a figure emerged. Tracy leaned forward, her fingers gripping the steering wheel so hard the leather groaned. She expected a flash of silk, the scent of jasmine, or the silhouette of a woman who had stolen her husband's nights. But the person who stepped into the dim amber glow of the single flickering streetlight was a man in a rumpled windbreaker, clutching a thick manila envelope. Even from the distance, Tracy recognized the stiff, unmistakable posture of law enforcement. She watched frozen as the man handed the envelope to Tae-Il. They spoke in low, urgent tones, their breath blooming in the cold air like small ghosts. Tae-Il took a seat on a rusted crate, flipping through the documents with a grim intensity. He wasn't gifting a life to a mistress. He was selling his own. He was handing over the inner workings of the Kwon syndicate, piece by bloody piece. The secret life Tracy had spent days grieving wasn't an affair of the heart, but a desperate, lethal gamble for freedom. As the man in the windbreaker vanished back into the shadows and Tae-Il leaned his head against the brick wall, looking utterly broken under the rain, the jealousy that had consumed Tracy vanished. It was replaced by a cold, sharp terror. She realized that the silent war they had been fighting at home was nothing compared to the one he was fighting in the dark. He wasn't trying to replace her. He was trying to save her from the very world she had blamed him for. The receipt for the apartment wasn't for a love nest. It was for a relocation, a way out. Tracy sat in the dark, the rain drumming a frantic warning on her roof, realizing that her husband wasn't a traitor to their marriage, but he was a dead man walking if the syndicate ever found out what she had just witnessed. The transformation of the penthouse began at sunset, not with a flourish of trumpets, but with the sharp, rhythmic sound of a knife hitting a wooden cutting board. For years, the kitchen had been a cold monument of stainless steel and unused marble, but tonight, the air was heavy with the smell of garlic, rosemary, and seared ribeye. Tracy didn't wear her usual armor of silk. She wore a simple apron over a dark dress, her movements precise and deliberate. She wasn't just making a meal, she was setting a stage for the truth. When Tae-Il walked through the door at his usual late hour, the sight of a set table and the glow of warm candlelight caused him to stop dead in his tracks. He didn't look like the hardened boss of a syndicate in that moment. He looked like a man who had walked into the wrong house. The silence between them had always been a cold thing, but tonight it was charged with the hum of unspoken questions. "Sit," Tracy said, her voice calm but carrying the weight of a command. She didn't look up from the wine she was pouring. Tae-Il obeyed, lowering himself into the chair as if he expected it to collapse beneath him. The meal was served in a silence that felt different than the ones that had come before. It wasn't the silence of neglect, but the predatory stillness of a hunter waiting for the right moment to strike. Tracy watched him over the rim of her glass, her almond-shaped eyes tracking every twitch of his jaw. "You're eating like a man who hasn't had a home-cooked meal in 3 years," she said, her voice laced with a sharp, elegant bitterness. "Or perhaps you're just used to the lighter fare they serve in Buckhead." Tae-Il's fork paused halfway to his mouth. He looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers for the source of the fire. "Tracy," he began, his voice raspy from disuse, "if this is about where I go at night—" "I know where you go," she interrupted, her tone dropping to a whisper that cut through the room like a blade. "I know about the receipts, I know about the apartment, and I know about the rainy alleys behind the warehouses on the edge of the city." The air in the room seemed to vanish. Tae-Il's face went pale, his mask of indifference finally cracking to reveal a raw, jagged fear. He reached across the table, his hand hovering near hers but not quite touching, as if he was afraid he might burn. For a second, the silence almost broke. The words were right there on the tip of his tongue. The confession of his betrayal, the explanation for the manila envelopes, the truth about why he was trying to buy her a way out. "You shouldn't have followed me," he whispered, the words sounding less like a threat and more like a plea. "Tracy, you have no idea what you've walked into." "I walked into my marriage," she snapped back, her eyes shining with a mixture of fury and a vulnerability she hadn't allowed him to see in years. "And I'm not leaving until I know if I'm sitting across from a husband or a dead man." The fragile peace of the dinner table had barely cooled before the vultures began to circle. 2 days after the confrontation, while Tae-Il was away at an emergency meeting that felt more like a summons, the penthouse door chimes announced an unexpected visitor. It wasn't the husband Tracy was half expecting to see, but underboss Shin, Tae-Il's second-in-command and a man whose smile never quite reached his cold, obsidian eyes. He didn't wait to be invited in, stepping into the living room with a predatory elegance that made the vast space feel suddenly cramped. Tracy stood by the window, her rose-pink robe cinched tight, her posture regal but defensive. She had known Shin for years, but she had never liked the way he looked at her, as if she were a piece of collateral waiting to be liquidated. It's a quiet life you lead up here, Tracy, Shin remarked, his voice a smooth, oily baritone. He wandered toward the bar, pouring himself a drink without asking. Too quiet for a woman of your caliber. It's a shame Tae-Il doesn't see what he has right in front of him. Tracy didn't move, her eyes fixed on the city skyline. If you have a message for my husband, Shin, wait for him at the office. This is our home. Shin chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. Home? Is that what we're calling this mausoleum now? I'm here because I'm worried about you. Tae-Il has been distracted. The board is noticing. The late nights, the secret accounts in Buckhead. He thinks he's being discreet, but in our world, secrets are just debts that haven't been collected yet. He walked closer, stopping just outside her personal space. The scent of expensive tobacco and something metallic clung to him. He's cleaning house, Tracy. He's making moves to transition, to clean up his image for the next phase of his life. But men like Tae-Il don't just change their lives, they replace them. New assets, new locations, new companions who don't carry the baggage of the past. The seed was planted. Even though Tracy had seen the federal informant in the alley, Shin's words twisted her perspective like a funhouse mirror. Was the Buckhead apartment a sanctuary for them, or was it a fresh start for him? Was the informant a way to save her, or a way to trade her for immunity? He's looking for a way out, Shin whispered, leaning in as if sharing a confidence. But you should ask yourself if there's room for an ice queen in the new kingdom he's building, or if you're just the last bit of evidence he needs to bury. When Shin finally left, the silence he left behind wasn't the peaceful kind. It was a loud, thumping roar in Tracy's ears. She looked at the empty glass he had left on the marble counter and felt the familiar chill of the silent years returning. But this time, it was laced with a new, poisonous doubt. Pride had told her he didn't care. Now, Shin was telling her he was planning to erase her. And as the clock ticked toward 3:00 a.m. once again, she realized she no longer knew which version of her husband was the truth. The air in the penthouse was no longer just still, it was pressurized, a psychological storm front that had been gathering since Shin's departure. When the clock struck 3:00 a.m., the sound of the front door's electronic chime didn't just signal an arrival, it signaled an explosion. Tae-Il stepped into the foyer, his movements sluggish, his eyes shadowed by the weight of a world that was closing in on him. He saw Tracy immediately. She wasn't by the window this time. She was standing in the center of the living room, illuminated by the cold, blue moonlight. Her arms folded so tightly, she looked as though she were holding her soul together by force. Where is she, Tae-Il? The question wasn't a whisper. It was a low, vibrating growl that cut through the silence like a serrated blade. Tae-Il stopped, his hand still gripping his suit jacket. He looked at her with a mixture of exhaustion and confusion. Tracy, it's 3 in the morning. I've had a night you couldn't possibly imagine. Not tonight. Not tonight, she laughed, a sharp, jagged sound that had no joy in it. I've given you 3 years of not tonight. I've given you 1,000 nights of silence while you built a life in Buckhead and met with men in alleys. Who is she? Who is the woman who gets the version of you that I used to have? There is no one else, Tae-Il shouted, his voice cracking the polished veneer of his usual restraint. He threw his jacket onto the marble floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot. You think I'm out there looking for a replacement. You think I'm looking for warmth. Shin says you're cleaning house, Tracy screamed back, her pride finally shattering into raw, unadulterated pain. He says I'm just a piece of baggage you're waiting to bury so you can start your clean life. I saw the receipt, Tae-Il. I saw the apartment. You're leaving me behind. She stepped into his space, her eyes blazing with tears she refused to let fall. She pushed against his chest, her palms striking the white silk of his shirt. Talk to me. Damn it, Tae-Il. Say something that isn't a lie or a half-truth. Tell me why you're never here. Tae-Il grabbed her wrists, not to hurt her, but to still the frantic motion. His face was a mask of agony, the distance between them finally collapsing into a singular, devastating moment of honesty. I stayed out late to avoid your silence, he roared, his voice trembling with a vulnerability he had buried under miles of mafia business. I stayed out until 3 in the morning because the way you look at me makes me feel like a ghost in my own home. I'd rather be in a rainy alley, staring down a federal agent, than sit at that table and watch you pretend I don't exist. I was building that apartment for us, Tracy. A place where the syndicate couldn't find us, where I could be a husband again instead of a target. But how do I invite you into a new life when you haven't even spoken to me in the old one? The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the cold wall they had lived behind for years. It was the quiet of a battlefield after the final shot has been fired. Tracy's breath hitched, her hands going limp in his grasp. She looked at him, really looked at him, and realized that the Ice Queen hadn't been protecting her heart. She had been freezing him out of it. The receipt that had once been a jagged shard of glass in Tracy's heart now served as a map to a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Following the explosive confession in their living room, the silence that followed wasn't cold, it was fragile. Tae-Il had left for a final meeting that felt more like a goodbye, and Tracy, unable to sit within the hollow luxury of the penthouse, found herself driving toward the Buckhead address. She needed to see the physical evidence of his intent, to know if the man she had spent years freezing out was actually the one trying to set them free. The building was a discreet, high-security tower, the kind where the doormen were trained to forget faces, and the elevators moved in a quiet, pressurized hum. When Tracy stepped into the apartment on the 42nd floor, she didn't find the minimalist, bachelor den of a man keeping a mistress. She didn't find the sterile safe house of a criminal on the run. She found a home. The living room was bathed in the amber glow of a sunset she had missed while driving. As she walked through the foyer, her breath hitched. The walls weren't the cold, polished marble of their penthouse. They were a warm, inviting cream. In the center of the room sat a deep, velvet sofa in the exact shade of emerald green she had once mentioned loving in a magazine 3 years ago, a detail she thought had vanished into the ether of their shared silence. She moved deeper into the space, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood. On the kitchen counter sat a high-end espresso machine, the specific model she had looked at once before her heart had turned to stone. But it was the small things that broke her resolve. Beside the machine was a jar of the specific, rare coffee beans she used to order before she stopped caring about the morning ritual. In the master bedroom, the walk-in closet wasn't empty. It was staged with a capsule wardrobe of silk wraps, soft knits, and comfortable flats, clothes for a woman who no longer had to play the part of a mafia queen. And there, on a small writing desk by the window, lay the manila envelope she had seen in the rain. Tracy opened it with trembling fingers. Inside weren't just names of syndicate members or ledgers of illegal trades. There were 2 forged passports with new names. There were flight paths to a coastal town in Italy. There was a handwritten note in Tae-Il's sharp, disciplined script dated months ago, for Tracy, a place where she can finally laugh out loud again. The weight of her own pride crashed down on her then, more suffocating than any silence. She looked around the apartment and realized that while she had been building a throne of ice, he had been meticulously constructing a sanctuary. He had been listening to her even when she wasn't speaking. He had been memorizing her preferences even when she was looking right through him. The secret life wasn't a betrayal. It was a love letter written in real estate and risk. Tracy sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the passports to her chest, and finally let the tears fall, not for the marriage she thought she lost, but for the man she had nearly let die in the dark because she was too proud to ask him to stay. The drive back from Buckhead to the penthouse felt like a descent into a storm that had already broken. Tracy's mind was no longer a fortress of pride. It was a map of missed opportunities and silent apologies. She had spent 3 years ignoring the man who was building her a heaven, and now, as she pulled into the familiar underground garage, the air felt dangerously thin. The silence of the building, usually so comforting in its exclusivity, now felt like the held breath of an assassin. She entered the penthouse, expecting the usual hollow quiet, but found the lights dimmed to a low, amber glow. Tae-Il was there, but he wasn't sitting at his desk. He was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his back to the door, his silhouette sharp against the city lights. He didn't turn when she entered. "The apartment is beautiful, Tae-Il," she whispered, her voice trembling as she closed the distance between them. "The emerald sofa, the espresso machine, the passports, I saw it all." Tae-Il turned then, and the look in his eyes wasn't triumph or even relief. It was a cold, sharp alertness. "You shouldn't have gone there, Tracy. Not today. Shin has been watching. He's been waiting for a reason to move, and my distractions gave it to him." Before she could reach for his hand, the heavy mahogany doors of the penthouse didn't chime. They groaned under the force of a battering ram. The sound shattered the silent war once and for all. In an instant, the glass of the balcony shattered as a flashbang detonated, filling the room with a blinding white light and a roar that felt like the world ending. Shin's men didn't come with a summons. They came with suppressed rifles and the cold intent of a coup. Tracy felt Tae-Il's hand, solid and hot, grab her arm and pull her behind the reinforced marble of the kitchen island just as a hail of bullets shredded the designer curtains she had spent weeks choosing. "Stay low," Tae-Il commanded, his voice no longer the weary whisper of a neglected husband but the steel-edged roar of a commander. He pulled a compact handgun from a hidden compartment under the counter, his movements fluid and practiced. He looked at her then, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that burned away 3 years of resentment. "Tracy, look at me. Everything I did to get us out of here. But if we don't move now, there is no Italy. There is only this floor." Tracy didn't freeze. The Ice Queen had spent years practicing emotional survival, and that coldness now turned into a focused, lethal calm. She reached out, her fingers lacing through his, her grip just as tight as his was. The jealousy, the pride, and the silence were dead, murdered by the reality of the men crawling through their windows. "Tell me what to do," she said, her voice steady. Tae-Il offered a grim, fleeting ghost of a smile, the first real look of pride he had directed at her in years. He handed her a spare magazine from his pocket. "We move to the service elevator on 3. Don't look back. We fight our way out, or we don't leave at all." As the shadows of Shin's men moved across the wreckage of their living room, the two people who had lived as strangers for 3 years finally stood as one. The war at home was over. The war for their lives had just begun. The service elevator descended with a gut-wrenching lurch, the only sound the ragged breathing of two people who had finally stopped pretending they didn't need each other. When the doors hissed open into the bowels of the parking garage, the silence was a lie. Tae-Il didn't hesitate. He moved with a lethal, predatory grace that Tracy had only ever guessed at from behind the closed doors of his office. He wasn't the tired husband carrying his shoes anymore. He was the apex predator of the Kwon syndicate, and tonight he was hunting for their survival. "Key," he grunted, nodding toward the nondescript sedan Tracy had used to follow him days ago. It was the only car Shin's men wouldn't be looking for. As they dove into the seats, a black SUV roared around the concrete pillar, tires screaming against the polished floor. Muzzle flashes lit up the subterranean gloom like a strobe light. Tracy ducked as the rear window spiderwebbed into 1,000 crystalline shards. Tae-Il slammed the car into reverse, his arm thrown over the back of her seat, his eyes cold and calculating as he navigated the narrow maze of the garage. He didn't flinch when a bullet punched through the headrest inches from his ear. He just spun the wheel, the sedan's engine roaring in a desperate, mechanical protest, as he found the exit ramp and burst out into the rain-slicked streets of midnight Atlanta. The city was a blur of neon blue and bleeding red brake lights. Tracy gripped the door handle, her knuckles white, watching the speedometer climb. Behind them, 2 more SUVs emerged from the shadows of the high-rises, weaving through the light traffic with reckless intent. "Open the glove box," Tae-Il commanded, his voice as steady as if he were ordering coffee. "There's a remote. Press the silver button when I tell you." Tracy did as she was told, her fingers trembling but her resolve as hard as the ice she had lived behind for years. She watched Tae-Il work the wheel, one hand steering with impossible precision, the other reaching for his weapon. He wasn't just driving, he was playing a high-speed game of chess. He knew every alley, every blind spot, every timing of the traffic lights. As they approached the bridge over the interstate, Tae-Il's jaw tightened. Now. Tracy pressed the button. Behind them, a series of small, strategic charges he had planted weeks ago along the construction barriers of the bridge detonated. They weren't meant to kill, but to chaos. A wall of orange barrels and heavy debris collapsed into the path of the pursuing SUVs. The lead vehicle swerved, flipping onto its side in a shower of sparks and twisted metal, blocking the entire ramp. Tae-Il didn't look back. He veered off the main road, diving into the labyrinth of the industrial district where the shadows were deepest. Only when the silence of the rain took over did he finally let out a breath, his grip on the steering wheel loosening just a fraction. Tracy looked at him, the blood on his collar, the sweat on his brow, the absolute focus in his dark eyes, and realized she had never truly seen him until now. He had spent years playing the villain in her story, just so he could be the hero and the one that mattered, the one where she lived to see the sun. The industrial safe house was a far cry from the marble-floored luxury of their penthouse. It was a cavernous, drafty space at the back of a defunct textile mill, lit only by a single flickering bulb that cast long, skeletal shadows against the brick. As soon as the heavy iron door clattered shut, Tae-Il stumbled. The adrenaline that had fueled his high-speed precision through the streets of Atlanta was draining away, leaving behind a jagged, agonizing reality. Tracy caught him before his knees hit the concrete, her silk robe now stained with grease and rain, but she didn't flinch. It was only when she pulled her hand back from his side and saw the deep, spreading crimson on her palm that the breath left her lungs. "Tae-Il, you're hit," she whispered, her voice cracking for the first time that night. He slumped against a stack of wooden crates, his face the color of ash. "It's a graze," he lied, his teeth gritted against the pain. "Just help me sit." Tracy moved with a frantic, focused efficiency she didn't know she possessed. She tore a strip of fabric from the hem of her robe, pressing it firmly against the wound. The Ice Queen was gone. In her place was a woman fighting for the only man who had ever truly seen her. As she worked, the silence of the warehouse grew heavy, filled only with the sound of his labored breathing. "Why Tae-Il?" she asked, her eyes searching his as she applied pressure. "Why go to the feds? Why the apartment? You could have just stayed the boss. You could have kept the power." Tae-Il looked up at her, his dark eyes glazed but intensely fixed on her face. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I didn't want the power, Tracy. I wanted the loud laugh. The one you used to have before I brought you into this tomb." He coughed, a harsh sound that made him wince. "The feds, they wanted the ledger. They wanted the names of every underboss from here to Seoul, and I gave them everything, every blood-stained cent. I sold the syndicate for a house in Italy with a garden and a kitchen that doesn't smell like silence." Tracy felt a tear finally break free, tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. "You were going to give it all up, for me." "I was never giving anything up," he whispered, reaching up with a trembling hand to brush a stray lock of hair from her forehead. "I was buying back what I lost. I thought if I could just get you away from the guns and the shadows, maybe you'd look at me again, not as a monster but as the man who loved you." The truth was more devastating than any bullet. While she had been nursing her pride and resenting his late nights, he had been dismantling an empire, risking a traitor's death every single second just to hear her laugh again. He had been a hero in a story she refused to read. Tracy leaned her forehead against his, her blood-stained hand still holding the bandage in place, realizing that the man bleeding out in a drafty warehouse was the only kingdom she ever truly wanted to reign over. The warehouse was growing colder, and with every shallow breath Tae-Il drew, Tracy felt the urgency of their situation clawing at her throat. The manila envelope sat on the dusty floor between them, a heavy weight of secrets that could either buy their freedom or act as their death warrant. Tae-Il's hand was clammy as he pressed the encrypted burner phone into her palm. He couldn't move. The wound in his side had anchored him to the shadows, but Tracy realized that his weakness was now her greatest weapon. In the eyes of the syndicate, she was still just the Ice Queen, the ignored domestic ornament who knew nothing and did less. "They won't be looking for you," Tae-Il whispered, his voice a ghost of its former strength. "Shin thinks you're a ghost. Use it." Tracy didn't hesitate. She shed the rose-pink silk robe, leaving it draped over Tae-Il to keep him warm, and pulled on his discarded dark overcoat. She tucked the manila envelope against her chest, the sharp edges of the paper digging into her skin like a reminder of the stakes. She didn't look back as she stepped out of the textile mill and into the gray, pre-dawn mist of the city. She didn't take a car. She walked, a solitary figure moving through the early morning fog toward the Federal Building 3 blocks away. As she approached the perimeter, she saw them, Shin's men, positioned like statues in parked cars and shadowed doorways. They were watching the main entrances, their eyes scanning for Tae-Il, for a man with a certain stride and a certain silhouette. When Tracy walked past them, her head down and her stride hurried like a panicked civilian caught in the rain, they barely spared her a glance. To them, she was invisible. For 3 years, she had hated being the woman no one noticed in the room. Now, it was the only thing keeping her alive. She reached the designated drop point, a nondescript coffee shop across from the courthouse where the federal agent from the alley was waiting. Her heart was a frantic drum in her ears as she pushed through the door. The agent sat in a corner booth, his eyes widening in shock when he realized it wasn't the Mafia Boss sliding into the seat opposite him, but the wife. "Tae-Il is wounded," she said, her voice dropping into that low, regal tone that had once kept her husband at a distance. She slid the envelope across the table, her hands steady even as her world crumbled. "Everything is in there. The ledger, the offshore accounts, Shin's private communications. If you want the Kwon syndicate, you take it now. But you get him out. You get him out today." The agent took the files, his expression shifting from surprise to a grim, professional respect. He saw the blood on her sleeve, Tae-Il's blood, and realized that the Queen had just finished the game her husband started. Tracy didn't wait for a thank you. She stood up, her jaw set, and walked back out into the rain. She had made her gambit. She had used the silence of her marriage to scream the truth to the world. And now, all that was left to do was find her way back to the man who had risked everything to hear her laugh. The end of the Kwon syndicate didn't arrive with the cinematic explosion Tracy had feared, but with the cold, surgical precision of the law. As she sat in the back of a black government SUV, her hand gripped firmly in Tae-Il's, his side now professionally bandaged by a federal medic, she watched through the tinted glass as their world was dismantled. The blue and red lights of a dozen patrol cars bounced off the mirrored glass of the penthouse tower, turning the monument to their silent years into a crime scene. Federal agents swarmed the building, hauling out the ledgers, the encrypted hard drives, and the men who had once treated the city like their private playground. Shin was led out in handcuffs, his expensive suit rumpled and his face a mask of incredulous fury. When his eyes caught Tracy's through the SUV window, she didn't look away. She didn't offer him the satisfaction of her hatred. She simply looked at him with the same calm, unbothered indifference she had once used to punish her husband. Shin had tried to use her silence as a weapon. Instead, it had become his cage. By dawn, the empire was a hollow shell. The offshore accounts were frozen, the safe houses were raided, and the name Kwon was stripped of its lethal weight. For the first time in his life, Tae-Il was no longer a king. He was a man with a clean record and an empty bank account. The Mafia Boss had been executed by a signature on a plea agreement, leaving behind only the husband who had been hiding in the shadows for 3 years. They sat together in a safe house on the outskirts of the city, a place that smelled of pine and fresh air instead of gunpowder and old secrets. Tae-Il leaned back against the simple wooden chair, looking smaller without the tailored suits and the shadow of his underbosses, but his eyes were clearer than Tracy had ever seen them. He looked at his hands that no longer held the lives of thousands, and then he looked at her. "It's gone, Tracy," he whispered, his voice steady. "Everything. The penthouse, the cars, the status. I have nothing left to give you but a name that doesn't mean anything to anyone anymore." Tracy reached across the small kitchen table, her fingers interlacing with his. The Ice Queen had finally melted, leaving behind a woman who didn't need a crown to feel powerful. She looked at the man who had traded an empire for a chance to hear her laugh, and she realized that, for the first time in their marriage, they were actually standing on level ground. "You didn't give me nothing, Tae-Il," she said, her voice soft but filled with a new, vibrant warmth. "You gave me a husband, and that's the only thing I ever actually wanted to keep." The empire had fallen, but as the sun began to rise over a city that no longer feared them, Tracy realized that the silent war was finally over. They were broke, they were starting over, and they were finally, dangerously free. The transition from the 64th floor to a modest cottage on the outskirts of a quiet coastal town didn't feel like a fall from grace. It felt like a long overdue exhale. Gone were the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over a kingdom of concrete and secrets. In their place were simple wooden frames that opened to the scent of salt air and blooming jasmine, the very fragrance that had once been a source of agonizing jealousy, now reclaimed as a symbol of their fresh start. It was 5:00 p.m., an hour that in their previous life would have signaled the beginning of Tracy's long, lonely vigil. Back then, she would have been draped in silk, nursing a glass of wine and a heart made of flint. But today, the Ice Queen was nowhere to be found. Tracy stood on the small front porch, her feet bare against the sun-warmed grain of the wood. She wore a simple cotton sundress, her long hair tied back loosely, her dark skin glowing in the amber light of a sun that was finally beginning to set on their terms. The sound of a gravel driveway crunching under tires reached her ears. It wasn't the aggressive roar of a high-performance Italian engine or the screech of a black SUV shadowed by bodyguards. It was the hum of a sensible sedan, a vehicle that belonged to a man who didn't need to outrun his past anymore. Tae-Il stepped out of the car, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows, his posture relaxed in a way that seemed almost alien compared to the rigid commander he had once been. He wasn't carrying his shoes to sneak past a shadow. He wasn't looking for a ghost. He looked toward the porch, and when his dark eyes met Tracy's, the intensity in them wasn't born of calculation or danger. It was the pure, unadulterated relief of a man who was exactly where he wanted to be. He walked up the steps, the wood groaning softly under his weight, a homey, honest sound. He didn't offer a report on the day's business or a cryptic excuse for his whereabouts. He simply reached out, his hand finding the curve of her waist, and pulled her into a hug that tasted of the outdoors and absolute peace. "You're early," Tracy whispered into the crook of his neck, her voice vibrant and warm. The last of the frost finally melted away. "I told you," Tae-Il murmured, his breath warm against her temple. "I'm done with 3:00 a.m. I'd rather see the sunrise with you at 5 in the evening than spend another night pretending I don't hear you breathing on the other side of a wall." They sat together on a weathered porch swing, the rhythmic creak of the chain serving as the only soundtrack to their new life. There was no luxury here, no marble, no millions, no titles that commanded fear. There was only the weight of his shoulder against hers and the steady beat of two hearts that had survived a war of their own making. As the sky turned a deep, bruised purple and the first fireflies began to dance in the tall grass, Tracy leaned her head back and let out a soft, melodic laugh. It was the sound of a woman who was no longer a trophy, no longer a ghost, and finally, no longer ignored. If Tracy and Tae-Il's journey from icy silence to a hard-won peace moved you, don't let their story end here. Support the channel by hitting that like button and subscribing for more high-stakes romance. What part of their transformation was your favorite? Let us know in the comments below and share this video with someone who loves a masterpiece.